This is a virtual event by Healthtech Hub Copenhagen, and I'm super happy to see you all and thank you for joining us today, where our topic is clinical investigation in health tech, how to set up a study and obtain valid data. For that, we have invited Helene Quie back from Qmed. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Denise Brun Ancionas. I am Head of Communication and Community here at Healthtech Hub Copenhagen, and I will be your host today. Like I said, this is part 2 of our mini-series with Helene, and Helene also joined us last month for part 1, and I think all of you should have received an email by now with the link to that. And otherwise, we can send it again, along with this, which is being recorded. So I hope that you're all up to date with the first part and therefore ready to continue today. But before we get started with the agenda, I'll quickly run through the practicalities. First of all, this event is being recorded, as I've said a few times now. And for this and for other reasons, we ask you to have your camera turned off and stay muted if you're not speaking. If you do have any questions, you can either raise your hand or ask them in the chat as we go along. There'll be breaks along the way that can give you the option to ask questions, but just ask along the way or raise your hand in Teams, and I'll try to keep track of them all and make sure that Helene has a chance to answer them. So, as I mentioned before, our guest is Helene Quie from Qmed. She will go through this important topic of MDD and MDR and clinical investigation in health. But first, I'll just give you a quick introduction to Healthtech Hub Copenhagen. We are a non-profit organization, and we'll celebrate our 2 years anniversary soon. I'll send you an invitation in the chat to that event as well. Which you're more than welcome to join. We are supported by a range of really great partners, both core partners, as you can see here on this slide, but also other partners and collaborators. So first of all, thank you to our partners for your support, both in form of financial investments, but also in terms of time and knowledge and input. And without you, we couldn't do what we're doing. And it's basically an entire ecosystem of partners, and together we push the health agenda forward. On top of our core and commercial partners, we'd like to thank our technology partners, anything from Google and Amazon and Microsoft to HubSpot and ContractBook. And we're also supported by international initiatives such as Healthtech Nordic and the Trade Council by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark, and other important ecosystem partners such as Bioinnovation Institute and IT Health. Yeah, like I said, you're the reason why we're here. And the reason why we need these important partners and collaborators is that we want to accelerate the adoption of clever health tech solutions, and doing this by breaking the adoption bottlenecks. There is a lot of really clever innovation happening in technology, and that also affects healthcare. But we also see a gap between what is being invented and what is being implemented. Now, our grand mission is to improve health and reduce health costs for 1 billion people worldwide. And we expect to achieve this through our members and their health tech solutions, which we consider to be among the best in Denmark, at least. They're achieving really great things in making life easier and healthier and better for their users. And we really want to help them reach even more people. So we do this through different accelerating forces in the health tech ecosystem. You're welcome to reach out if you'd like to know more about this, because the most important topic today is the regulatory side of health tech. And this is the expertise of others, of in the ecosystem, such as Helene Quie. And that's why we've invited her to share some of her knowledge. So welcome back, Helene. We're super happy to have you again. And it was really interesting the last time, and I really hope that people will get as much out of today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me again. I think I invited myself. I apologize for that, but it was a good session last time, and there is so much to tell within this field, so I'm just really happy that I get the opportunity once more. So should I start, Denise?
Yes, you're welcome.
Good. So I will introduce myself first. I can see that there are a few of the people that I know that attend this course, so also welcome to you. I'm impressed that you join even when you know me, but that's good sign. But my name is Helene Quie, and I have a background as a cell biologist. I have worked with medical devices since '95, so it's from that time when we basically did not really have any regulation, or the new directive actually was just published. And I worked with medical devices since then within the clinical and regulatory field. Latest for a startup company as a clinical responsible, but I have also worked for larger companies. So I know both of these worlds, so to speak. Beside, of course, my dear family, I am devoted, or what you say, dedicated to medical device and the development and the way that it influenced the patient health. I find it extremely interesting, and therefore I really love to share the know-how and knowledge and my interpretation of the regulation, which I will do today. And the topic is clinical investigation, and there is a lot of different topics that we'll go through today, and I think I will jump to my own slides, Denise, if that's okay, because I have a tendency to go a little bit back and forward. So let me know if you can see my slides, Denise.
We can see your slides, it's working.
Sounds good, good. So I have based today's presentation on, of course, I will follow the agenda, but I will also try and explain a little bit about what is coming with the new regulation. What is it that we are facing here in about a month's time, or 1.5 months? It's coming pretty soon with the new medical device regulation, and what does it mean for clinical investigation of medical devices. Feel free to, as Denise said, ask questions, write them in the chat. I will run through the slides and then we'll make breaks. There are no workshops today because it's a little more tricky to do that for clinical investigation topic as we had the last time, but we will have break for questions. So having said that, let me just mention that this is what I do for a living beside teaching and training. I'm a consultant, and I also have a CRO, so conducting clinical studies ongoing on a daily basis and helping clients with providing the documentation which is required before, during, and after a clinical study, and what we can use the data for. So I hope to be able to use that and link that to the regulatory requirements today. But feel free, it's a big topic, it's a lot to talk about. If you want me to address other topics within this field, you just let me know, and I will try and answer as good as I can. So let's go moving forward here. So just before we really get into the topic, there is a couple of key things to know when you're conducting clinical studies. Now, we as a company, Qmed Consulting it's called, we were audited last week by TÜV Süd to get our ISO 14155 certification. So what is ISO 14155? Well, it is the Bible. So if you're conducting clinical investigation with medical devices, this is the document that you should know. It is a very well-written ISO standard that describes the different phases of conducting a study with medical devices. It's like GCP for devices, that's also what we call it. What has happened now under the new medical device regulation, which I actually forgot to mention here, but you can Google the medical device regulation that comes into force now here May 26, 2021. They actually incorporated a lot of the text in the guidance, but from the 2011 version, this is the 2020 version that came out last year, but the 2011 version is more or less incorporated into the regulation, so now it is law. And therefore you will have to learn it anyhow. Beside the ISO standard and of course the regulation, there is published a lot of guidance that can help you along the way. There is what's called a medical device coordination group established by the European Commission, which is 2 members from each member state that are basically they're in some groups and they are writing guidance documents that comes directly from the regulation. So they are independent of companies and other commercial interest, and they are writing these guidance documents. The MDCD guidelines have, or the MDCD have published a lot of guidelines within clinical investigation and clinical evaluation that we discussed last time. The clinical evaluation on safety reporting, the MDCD 2020-10-1 and 2, is available here from May 2020. And this is because we have new rules for reporting of safety events during a clinical study. And also there is a summary safety form included in this guideline. So very importantly, I will keep track on or open the MDCD, Google it and find out what has been published since last time and to make sure that you keep an eye on this. These are really important information on how to interpret the legislation. There are also some MD guidance or the MD guidelines. These are the old guidelines. So this is what we have followed for many, many years. There are also some safety reporting guidelines. The MDCD guidelines will take over more or less when time has passed. Now the regulation is quite new, so the immediate guidelines are still available. And then we have, for more international driven clinical studies, there are also the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, or IMDRF. They are publishing a lot of guidelines also on the clinical area that can support you along the way if you are conducting studies worldwide. But the topic for today is the medical device regulation and the ISO standard. What does it give us of information to set up, start, conduct and close down a clinical study? So if we look into the medical device regulation in the Article 2, there are specific definitions. And last time we talked about clinical evaluation, which is the document that kind of prepares for clinical investigation. This is where you will find out if a clinical investigation is actually necessary for you to CE mark your product on the European market. By definition, the clinical investigation means any systematic investigation involving one or more human subjects undertaken to assess the safety and performance of a device. And it's important here to realize that there is a difference here between data collected in US and data collected in Europe, that we focus on 2 different things also within the device world. In Europe, we always look for safety and performance endpoints, and in US, we look for safety and efficacy endpoints. That means that if you are conducting studies in US, most likely you will have to be very much aware that you are that you have performance endpoint included in your clinical study. And the other way around, conducting studies in Europe, you might need to add a more efficacy-based endpoint. Also here with the definition, it says that it's involving one or more human subjects. So you previously, it was sometimes that test done on just one person was not considered as a clinical investigation, but now the regulation clearly states that one or more human subjects. When this is conducted, it is a clinical investigation and this law is applicable. An investigational device is a device that you are using during a clinical or is assessed in a clinical investigation. So investigational devices can be different from the actual device that you would like to market at a certain point. But depending on how the device is actually being developed. Normally, you would conduct a clinical investigation very late in the development process, when you are at a stage where you can no longer mitigate the risk, the clinical risk, beside conducting a clinical study. But there are also, in the development of some devices, you will have to have early stage data to be able to get input to the development of your device, such as, for instance, softwares. There you normally would need some clinical data to actually build up the algorithm. So this is very early stage clinical investigations, and we will come back to that, what the different phases actually means and when they are conducted. A clinical investigation plan is what we would normally call a protocol. We call it sometimes abbreviated as SIP, and it is a document that describes rational, objective design methodology, monitoring statistical considerations, the organization, and how you're going to conduct a clinical investigation. So there are specific points that you would need to address in your clinical investigation plan. The whole setup and the format is defined in the regulation and in more detail in the guideline ISO 14155. The last definition I would like to mention is that the sponsor. The sponsor means any individual company, institution, or organization which takes the responsibility for setting up the study and making sure that it is running, manage it, and also setting up the financing of the investigation. It has opened up under this new regulation, this wording actually, that a sponsor can be an individual company, any company, institution, or organization. It means practically that we as a CRO now are running as a sponsor many of the, or some of the clinical studies, because of lack of resources with the manufacturers. They are outsourcing the whole bit of it to a CRO. So this is something new. This is what have not been available in the regulation before under the MDD. So what is changing from the MDD to the MDR? A lot of changes, but basically looking into for the clinical investigation, we had previously in the wording in Annex 10, which was the it was a 2-pager in the MDD, so the Medical Device Directive, the legislation that is actually applicable today until May 26, was 2 pages. Now we have several articles and annexes that describes how to conduct clinical investigation. So the regulation is much more helpful in guiding us in the way to conduct clinical studies. So it said specifically that in the case of implantable devices and devices in Class 3, clinical investigation shall be performed unless it was duly justified to rely on existing clinical data. We're now looking into the text in the MDR. It says for Class 3 medical devices and implantable medical devices should, as a general rule, be sourced from clinical investigation. There is not that much change here from the MDD to the MDR. It's always been like this, that for high-risk class products, you were obliged to provide clinical evidence to support your CE mark of your device. But the interpretation and the way that the notified bodies are looking into this now, and we of course will have to wait to see how they take action now from May, is that you can no longer, as we could in the old days, be able to, based on the literature route, actually for high-risk class product, use literature to support the safety and performance of the device and get it CE marked. So that opportunity has kind of decreased with the new regulation. It is generally said, and let me just look at, it is, I think that's also why it is of great interest to many people on how to conduct clinical study, is that the requirement for data has increased or will increase under the MDR. That is what the notified bodies is stating right now. In practical, we will have to see how this is going to be managed. The statements that I hear is that previously we have 500,000 medical devices in Europe, and 80% of these devices under the MDD was approved through the literature route. And now under the MDR, this will be just vice versa. So 20% will be able to be approved based on literature. The rest will have clinical data to support the CE marking. But let's see. So practical things first. So looking into what do we actually have to have in place to conduct a clinical study? What do you need to consider if you're standing in front of the need of actually conducting a study under the MDR? First of all, find the chapters and the annexes about clinical investigation in the MDR and read through it carefully. Remember again, if you are comparing it with an ISO standard 2020, that you just bought the ISO 14155 and you can't specifically find the same text, it is because MDR referred to the old ISO 14155 from 2011. But let's just go through some of the topics that we'll also address during this presentation. So one thing at the top about claims. It has been really underestimated what the claims mean for your clinical investigation and which claims where you would need clinical evidence to support that. There is a high focus on this topic these days, also from the notified bodies, that you have a clear understanding of which claims you can verify or validate with other methods than actually conducting a clinical investigation, so a clinical validation. So I really encourage to have full control of your claims. What do you want to claim for your product beside your safety and performance objectives, the key elements of your product? What is it? How does it perform? And what do you mean by safe? How is your product defined as safe? You probably have other statements around your product that will either need, or they will all need some kind of data, and they will have to be verified or validated. The same with a clinical risk. Risk can be split up in different groups depending on what they are relating to, but there are risks that are specifically related to the clinical use of your product and that can only be validated through a clinical investigation. We talked about the ISO standard, so I'll skip that. Declaration of Helsinki. If you are inspected during a clinical investigation, this is one of the key documents that they will ask you if you know about this. And hopefully everyone within this field knows about the Declaration of Helsinki, that this is our basic rules, the understanding of how to conduct clinical studies involving human subjects, how we treat these subjects, and these core elements from the declaration, which has been signed by parties all over the world, that this is how we conduct human experiments, basically. This is how we would like to do it. So our regulation and all the guidelines are basically done on this foundation. Then one thing also to be aware about, it will still be present under the MDR, is that there are specific requirements from the member states. So even though that you knows about where in the country where you are, how it is to conduct a clinical study, conducting a study in France compared to conducting a study in Denmark is absolutely not the same. Even though that the Medical Device Directive at that time when it was published was meant to be a European legislation, but what happened was that when it was incorporated into the law text, in the national law text, few changes were done, and there are specific requirements for Italy, Spain, and all the other countries, and you have to kind of do a little detective work to find out what are the requirements. It will be better now under the MDR because MDR is a regulation and will have to be implemented directly into the law text in the national member states regulation. But what will happen is that the change with the MDR will also mean a change of, for instance, the Ethics Committee regulation, and that is not something that the European Commission is kind of dictating. That is still the national requirement. So the submission for the, for instance, competent authorities to be able to conduct a study can be more or less aligned and unified throughout Europe now with the, for also what's mentioned here, the Qmed database. I will come back to that, and the single submission program. But you will have to consider still the national requirement in regards to its data safety, and it's also the ethics committee, and there could be other committees that you would have to have in mind when you are preparing for a study. We even had an international European study where in Denmark it was not considered as a study, but more data collection. But in France and Germany, this was a full-blown clinical study with both submissions to the ethics committee and the competent authority. So make sure that you invest time in finding out, the other way, what to do, make a plan. So other consideration for clinical investigation, as just mentioned, keep an eye on all the relevant legal and regulatory requirements. Prepare yourself, because otherwise you will not be able to actually make a good time plan for how this study can actually be conducted. And probably some of you come from small startup companies, and these small startup companies, they have a certain burn rate, and all weeks, all days are important. So you might even choose other countries than the ones that you already looked at because of the prolonged, for instance, the evaluation period needed to look into an investigation. Then there are certain procedures and templates. They're also described in the MDR. The CIP is the protocol, the clinical investigation plan. It's described in the Annex A, and also of the ISO standard, and the clinical investigational brochure, which is kind of a summary of the technical documentation of your device, is described in the Annex B of the ISO standard. What's important to realize is that there are an investigator's brochure, the CIP, it's difficult to hear, but the brochure where you have your technical documentation is normally only required when you are conducting a study with a non-CE marked device. That is one thing. The other thing is that we had a training the other day conducted, and there was some confusion about if you were conducting investigator-initiated trials, which are trials where a hospital is initiating a study on, it's not on your behalf, they are on their own behalf, but you have some kind of funding put in place for them to conduct the study, and you are keeping arm's length to the study, and we call that an investigator-initiated study. If it's a pre-CE mark device from you as a manufacturer, they would still need then to submit to the competent authority, including an investigator's brochure. Otherwise, there is a risk that these data will not be approved later on to be used for CE marking because they are collected without asking for the proper approvals. So that is just important to keep in mind. Informed consent, we'll go through the requirements under the medical device regulation later on. Then there are different stakeholders that you need to keep an eye on or to have identified. The sponsor that we had per definition before, normally it is the manufacturer, but it is opened up for now that other people, other groups, organizations can be a sponsor and have the sponsor responsibility according to the ISO standard. You also need to have qualified investigators. This means the sites, the hospitals, the physicians, the nurses that are working at these hospitals, that they are qualified. And this is a process that you will need to go through to qualify the different parties in the study. You will have to have a site identified, and there are different procedures related to that, how to qualify these also. And then the approval from the competent authority and also a clearance from the ethics committee is required. We will go through that in detail under the new medical device regulation later. And then insurance. Insurance is important, and it's also different from country to country. So besides looking after how the approval process is for a clinical investigation, so again, pre-CE mark you need from competent authority and the ethics committee if it's a post-CE mark study. So your product is already on the market and has a CE mark. It's only the ethics committee. But for both of these studies, depending on which country that you are conducting your study in, you would need more or less insurance. Now, I come from Denmark. In Denmark, we have a public, we pay tax, we pay a lot in tax. That means that if something goes wrong at the hospital, there is a public insurance to pay for whatever damage was done. The thing is that even in Denmark, the insurance, the payment, the amount is relatively low. So if something goes really, really wrong, there is a risk that the patient or the family will go to court, find a lawyer, and then they will sue you, and then the insurance from the public insurance is not enough. And therefore, even in Denmark, there is a supportive insurance for conducting clinical studies. If you go down south, there are some other specific insurance requirements that you would need to look into, and normally I recommend to go to its specific insurance companies that you will have to go to. And we normally use, in 80% of the times that we are in charge of insurance, we go to an insurance broker and ask for help, just because that the differences nationally are quite big. So in Article 62 of the Medical Device Regulation, there is some general requirements about conducting a clinical investigation. So again, the investigation is to verify safety and performance. This is basic. This is what it's all about. You want to verify how your product is working and the clinical safety is in patients, or how your product is used. And this documentation, you are using that for your CE mark. You don't have enough information to CE mark your product. You also want to verify the intended benefit for the patient when used in the intended purpose in the target population and in accordance with the instructions for use. The intended benefits is the same as what you would actually claim for your product. So here again, the safety and performance, we call them sometimes objectives. What is the key performance statement that you would like to say about your product, and also safety-wise? And then you can have other claims, benefits for the patients. How are you going to verify these? And again, some of them are clinical related and some can be verified or validated in other means. Then you also want to see if there are any additional undesired side effects. So some things you can only see when you test in patients. And this is why we gradually, with a high-risk class product, you will start with a small amount of patients, or have a larger investigation with maybe 100, 150 patients, but then start up with maybe 10, 12 patients to be able to have under control any undesired side effects that might have an influence that you didn't know, you didn't see it in the lab or any other verification test. The rights and the safety of well-being of subject is really something which is key within the medical device regulation. It is, you will have to demonstrate that you know about how to conduct studies, but also to be able to take good care of the patients, that you follow basic principles from the Helsinki declarations, and the treatment that you are offering are still, the benefit risk ratio are still in the favor to the subject. Scientifically valid, reliable, and robust. So the studies need to make sense. So 3 or 4 pages protocols where the details are really not enough, and the setup of the data collection is really random, is not a scientifically valid, reliable, and robust study. And also scientifically valid means that you would have some kind of statistical consideration for your study. If it's an early stage study, you can actually argue that you do not need a statistical rationale, because you will later on, after the 10, 12 patients, you will conduct a larger study that is scientifically valid. But then you explain that in your protocol. Then you have to, according to the law, make sure that there is a scientific and ethical review per national law. That is the ethics committee, and we mentioned that before, and we will have more details about that. There are a whole section in the medical device regulation about vulnerable populations, and this can be children, it can be pregnant women, it can be people that are maybe in prison, or that they have some specially inhable patients. They are not conscious patient, unconscious it's called, patients. These are what we call vulnerable populations. And I know that there are quite some companies also that are conducting investigations. They have very nice protocols and descriptions of studies they are conducting on employees. Sometimes they forget it, that employees are also considered as vulnerable subjects. There is a relationship between the company and the employee, and you have to take that into consideration and make sure that they are, the way that these studies are set up also gives the employee an option of not participating without that there are any damage, or what you call it, repercussion to this subject. Informed consent is required. It's a key element in setting up a study. And then you would need a sponsor in EU or legal representative. This is somebody in the European area that can take care about the study or will be responsible in case something is happening. So if you're a sponsor from outside of Europe, you will have to have a legal representation in Europe during your clinical study. Design, conduct, recording and reporting aspects in regards to both the data and also the safety reporting is specifically described, and we will walk through these new requirements which are stated in the Annex 15 also, in the Article 62 to 81. And then there are specific requirements for investigator and personnel, and we were just audited last week up against the ISO 14155, and what they're really careful about is that you know about the requirements that is both to the sites but also to you as a sponsor, manufacturer, and us as a CRO. This was very clearly stated from the notified body, and important to know that you need to know the regulation and the guideline and what is your responsibility. So the general requirements, the ethical considerations. So every step in a clinical investigation, from both the first consideration that there is a need and also the justification to the publication of results, shall be based on recognized ethical principles. So again, back to the Helsinki, to the guidelines, and also to the national requirements. These are all in our Bible, the ISO 14155. It is based on these ethical principles that are important to know. It is actually, you have to have the mindset which these ISO standard, or this ISO standard, is based on when you're conducting the clinical study, and you have to demonstrate that and document it. So the methods, as we mentioned before, a lot of these methods were more or less guided by national member state legislation before, but now it is a European, the medical device regulation, that guides us how to set up a clinical investigation. And you will have to have a proper plan in place based on your clinical evaluation plan that we talked about last time. And it has to reflect the latest scientific and technological knowledge that is available, and confirming your claims regarding safety, performance, and the benefit risk ratio. Have the proper number of patients, be proper design, have statistical methods included, and describe the procedures in detail, the research methodology. And there have to be this description that where you are, it's like a recipe for how this investigation is set up, that demonstrate that you have full control of the whole process, that your endpoints are defined, and you know how to make sure that the competences and the experience of the investigator is documented. So assessed and documented, and everything will be concluded in a report. What I actually see a lot of times is that when companies have conducted these very nice and very expensive studies, they're in a hurry, they don't get their reports finalized, and they're not really in a proper state. These reports with the Qmed database is now going to be uploaded into this database, and therefore I really encourage people to have an eye on the clinical investigational report, which is the ending of the investigation. The chapter 2 in the Annex 15 is that it's about the application. So the application, I have a slide later on about that, is now going to be centralized for pre-CE mark studies, where you are submitting through the Qmed database. So the application form and with the detailed content and requirements are described in the regulation. Key are the investigator's brochure, the clinical investigation plan, and then there are other requirements that we will look into now. So the protocol content, what's really nice with the medical device regulation is that you can more or less now read it in the regulation what you will have to do. And if you have been conducting clinical investigations before, you will not be surprised about seeing any of these bullet points, what a protocol needs to contain. If you are new within this field, I would encourage to go into the read the medical device regulation, and then find this section in the section 15, and then go through it and make your template for your clinical investigation plan and build it based on that. Don't try to make anything fancy-wancy, but follow the regulation. That is the best. Now, we will not go through this, don't worry, but this is actually from the regulation side. They have, by writing in detail what an application should contain, they have made it much more easy for us actually to follow. So here from the Annex 6, Chapter 2 in the medical device regulation, it is stating exactly what needs to be provided for an application before a clinical study. Beside that, you would need to have a signed statement that the device conforms with the general safety and performance requirements, the GSPR. It's what we called in the old days the essential requirement checklist. It is where you make sure that the essential requirements that are described in the Annex 1 of the medical device regulation are fulfilled, except for, of course, the requirements where you would need clinical evidence to fulfill this. You would also need to have a copy of the opinion from the ethics committee, or according to the local law, the insurance, the informed consent, and then any arrangement to comply with applicable rules to protect confidentiality of personal data. This is a huge topic within conducting clinical studies, is where are the data and what will happen in case that you lose some of these data. So the whole GDPR influence on how to conduct clinical investigation is one of the reasons why we have a specialist within GDPR, which is the data protection regulation, is because it has become really problematic conducted in this the right way, or as good as possible. So keep an eye on that. The ethics committee in Denmark, for instance, is looking after the confidentiality of personal data, or GDPR, but in other countries, this is handled in different ways. So also make sure that you investigate that upfront. You also have to have technical documentation available. So remember what we in the old days called technical file is now technical documentation. So this can be your risk analysis or risk management plan or report, specific test report. It can be your biological evaluation report and plan, or verification test, functional testings. This you would also need to have available because it feeds into your investigator's brochure, and you have to demonstrate that your product is safe and performs according to the essential requirements. And the only points that you are missing are the data points that you are collecting during the clinical investigation. There are other sponsors' obligations, so keep available for the competent national authorities any documentation necessary to provide evidence for the application. You need to have some kind of arrangement in regards to what's called serious adverse events. So events that are happening for the subjects that are serious per definition. So this can be different places, either in the protocol or in a separate safety reporting plan, but you will have to have an agreement with a different stakeholder how this is performed. So like now the COVID-19 and the vaccine studies, we have these events with some bleeding events, or that they have a stroke. And these reports are going to be handled by the authorities, and everyone would have to have some kind of idea, the sites, the manufacturers, how are we reporting this, how fast are we doing it, so the process are lean, and we will not it will not be a risk to the subjects that they are included in the studies. Also important is that retention of documents is 10 years after the end of the clinical investigation, or at least 10 years last device have been placed on the market, which is 15 years for implants. So make sure that you can store documents basically forever. It is really, it's a requirement, of course, in case something happens, that you are able to provide the documentation which belongs to the investigation. A funny thing which is also mentioned in the Annex 15 is that complete the follow-up for investigation subjects. And for me, it seems obvious, but this has apparently seems to be a problem in some of the investigations. Therefore, the authorities or the European Commission have really emphasized that you have to stick to the plan and follow the investigational subjects. And maybe also, if there is an additional risk, you find that through the update of your risk assessment, that there is some kind of unknown risk that you wasn't aware about, you will have to make sure that you make follow-up with your subjects on an ongoing basis. So you are allowed to do that after the approval from the Ethics Committee and the competent authorities. Also make sure that you are conducting, according to good clinical practice, internal and external auditing, and you also make sure that you have independent monitoring. This means, I've had that question a couple of times, and there are different interpretations of it. But what I heard last from somebody who are related to national authorities is independent monitoring means that it can be monitoring of your data, where you qualify the data. It's like accounting of data. You actually, independent means that the person that are monitoring is not also the same person that is responsible for the study. So you have this independency between these two people, and this monitor who are looking into the data refers to someone else, or the reporting goes to someone else, so that you are able to, in case something is wrong, that it will be escalated and taken care about from somebody who is not directly involved, maybe in writing the clinical investigation. And then, of course, be able to prepare, we talked about that just before, the clinical evaluation report. So the content to the informed consent. The informed consent is what you ask the subjects about before entering into a clinical study. So the patients will have to say yes or no to, and based on the information that you give them, that they are willing to be treated under this protocol. And there are specific requirements to what needs to be in a patient information or informed consent. This is the document, the key document, which is approved both by the competent authorities and also by the National Ethics Committee. So I'll not go through it in bullet points, but there are specific points here. If you conducted studies before, it's not of any surprise. These are standard content, but now it is regulated per law from the European Commission, and there will be less differences in between the different countries, hopefully. So this is what we are hoping for. We talked about vulnerable subjects. They are specifically addressed in different articles in the medical device regulation. As we mentioned before, pregnant, Article 60 6, and there are also minors Article 65. So just so you're aware that if you are conducting studies also with emergency situations, life-threatening or sudden serious medical conditions where the patients are not able to maybe answer themselves, there are specific requirements to follow now, and they are per regulation. So now it actually was meant for just having 2 minutes of a break, but I think we can have just for questions. Denise, is there any questions? Or did...
Yes, we do have some questions. First off, Christiania asks, what if the clinical investigation is going to be conducted outside a member state?
Then you follow that country's regulation, and you will have to make sure that if you want to use the data to support the CE marking in Europe, that the disease that is being treated under this protocol and the patients, that you can kind of build a rationale that the patients are similar in Europe compared to the study or to the place where you're conducting the study. For instance, diabetes, there is a difference in the patients between these patients in US and in Europe, for instance. They're larger than us, they have a different profile. So it will be a little difficult to build up that rationale. But there are other diseases where there are no difference between us. So you just need to be aware about that. I hope that answered the question.
Me too. Otherwise, let us know, Christiania. Thank you for your question. We also have a question from Moyin. Forgive me if I don't pronounce that correctly. Can a company be a sponsor if it has not been certified to ISO 14155? Or can it be a sponsor from the financial perspective, but another party ensures good clinical practice and that the study conforms to ISO 14455?
Yes, is the short answer. You don't have to have a certification for ISO 14155. We have it from TÜV Süd because it's our core business, right? So even before the audit, we did the same. So it's no different. So for us, it's a commercial value to be able to prove that. But as a company, you don't have to be ISO 14155 certified for sure. And you can split it. You just have to describe who is the sponsor, who is the financial parties, who are the investigators, and you describe that in the protocol very clearly so you can see how the different stakeholders are connected.
Thank you. And I hope that answered your question as well. There's one from Matthew coming in. We have MDD CE mark class 1 for AI software that triages medical images. What is the approximate amount of work required in moving to MDD class 2A?
You mean MDR class 2A or still MDD, Matthew? Maybe just write in the text.
Yes.
Yeah. It means that you will have to, the cost, if you have good documentation, and I think that's the, if we make that assumption that you is a good class 1 manufacturer and you have a full technical file with the whole shebang, then the extra cost is the cost for the certification by your notified body. That is the main thing. But of course, typically a class 1 manufacturer is, because they're self-certifying, both their system and their technical documentation, sometimes it's not really at appropriate level and follow the regulation. But I'm not saying that it's that for you, but it's what I see sometimes. Actually, sometimes there is no documentation for class 1 devices. And of course, then it's a cost. You will have to put at least 250 to 300 hours into build up of a technical file, and maybe the same for quality management system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good.
Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand as well and ask. But otherwise, I'll let it be up to you, Helene, if we need a break or if you want to keep going.
You know, I'm, you know, me, and I have so many slides, and I am 1/3. So if I can continue, anyone needs a bio break, otherwise I will just keep on moving.
All right, I'll let you continue then.
Yeah. Let me just go. I need to share my screen first, otherwise it doesn't work. There we go. So the application and reporting. There is a new system coming up now for the reporting of clinical studies within the European Commission. It's going to be centralized through the Qmed database. Practically what will happen is that it's like with the notified body, some private company is being designated to hold this responsibility, and they manage this database. And there are some specific timelines and other things that will change along the way, but more or less the internal process is the same. The requirements are the same. You will look after, as a reviewer, the same things. What will happen is that you will submit through a central portal. If it's a study that is conducted in one country, then this database, this company, will send your protocol most likely to that competent authority where you're going to conduct the clinical study. So they will be the coordinating party, and they will make sure that these different timelines that are mentioned in the blue arrow is fulfilled. The yellow activities are what you will, as a manufacturer or sponsor, will have to do, and the green boxes is what the member states will then do. So the Danish competent authorities for clinical investigation review will be the same, but they will get their task from this other country for the company. If you see in the blue line, there are some timelines. So when you are submitting to the Qmed database, this will be calculated as day 0. After 10 days, they will have validated if your study or your submission is complete. If it's a multi-center or multinational, it's called, study, you will have to include +5 days for this initial validation. If there are other things to update, it's not complete, you will have an option to withdraw, or you will have to correct and then submit it again, and there are 10 days to review this, +20 if it is a multinational study. Then it goes back to you and back and forward. At the end of the day, you will have to wait, if it's a class 3 product or invasive class 2A or 2B product, to wait for an approval. But other risk class products, after these, then 45 days, +20 days if it's a multinational investigation, then you will be able to start after you have your opinion from the ethics committee of the member states where you are conducting the study. So it's a new setup, but basically it's the same. It's more somebody who will coordinate the different reviews and make sure that the information is one place. Today, the competent authorities are speaking to each other. Now they will speak to each other through this Qmed database. So beside that, the database is not really working optimally right now, I don't think there is anything to worry about. And I just think it will be a more lean process at the end. There are extra information about the application process, just about the timing and what happens if it's not valid or approved, and do you have to restart, and all these things has not really been addressed yet, and we will have to wait to see how the European Commission would like to inform us about that. This I think I will skip because we already talked about that. So the electronic submission or registration of a clinical investigation for Europe, there is another special thing is that we will now have a single identification number for each clinical investigation. This will come through submission process through the Qmed database. And each entry point for submissions, notifications, and any other things will go through that database. So no longer, or you will have to report events to different countries and make sure that you coordinate well. Now this is done through the Qmed database. They exchange the information. They have one place for SAE and product efficiency reporting. This is also where they keep an eye on how you are protecting the personal data. They're also very keen on protecting commercial information. And why do I say that? It's because for class 3 products, you have special reports that will need to be uploaded in the Qmed database, which are commercially available. They are written in a lay term, and they are for the patients and the users. So this is also through the Qmed database. And they have, what they want is really to have they want to be able to, from a central place, to supervise or look after these clinical investigations, that nothing goes wrong and that they can take appropriate actions. And of course, the privacy is kept also within this database. So they're not really, there is some concern about the Qmed database and the whole setup, that we are now trying to build something which is really different from some of the other larger areas, but they have really tried to keep an eye on, by sticking to the ISO 14155 framework, that many of the other large areas where clinical studies are conducted, like Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, Japan, Russia, and US, they are also following the ISO 14155. So the now new European Commission set up with the Qmed database are based on this foundation, the Helsinki Declaration and the ISO 14155, even though that it is the old version. So what do we do with clinical investigations when the device is already CE marked? So where do these studies actually, where do they go? Where are they being approved? So if it has a CE marking and you're using it within the intended use, there you, and it involves submitting subjects to procedures additional to those performed under normal condition. And this is something which is new in some member states. You have to have a registration. You have to notify the member state at least 30 days before you are studying or starting the study. At least for some countries, I know that they have not been focused on this before. So these are with products where you are using the device within the intended use, but you add additional procedures, some MRI examinations, you maybe triple the MRI examinations, you will have to notify the member states. If you are using a product with CE marking, but for other purpose, like the intended use, so out of scope, well, you have to follow the submission process. You are a non-CE marked product then, even though that you have a CE mark for another intended use. And with CE marking within the intended use, there is no mentioning in the law how to proceed if there are no additional invasive or no burdensome procedure occurs. But you of course would need to have, it is expected that you have the ethics committee involvement and also insurance for these studies. So nothing has changed there. And this is why, for instance, in Denmark, everything has stopped with the ethics committee submissions right now, because they are preparing for the MDR regulation and they are not taking in any more studies for review. What if I then make some modifications to my protocol? So substantial notifications would need to be notified in the electronic system, so Qmed, within 1 week. And these are modifications that have an impact on safety, health, or right of patients, or if you have reports maybe from your data safety monitoring committee that your clinical data are at risk. Then not coming out as you want, there is something wrong here, you will have to notify your within the electronic system that there is a modification. You will have to also notify the involved member states about the reason and the content and documents according to the Annex 15. And then you will have to, you can implement the modifications after 38 days and plus 7 days if there are other member states involved. So there are some new things here which are now aligned more centrally. It becomes much easier to navigate because now we have one set of rules to follow. So there are no details right now. If you have not really, you have some changes, but they are non-substantial how this notification is going to be done, but there we will have to have some clarification. And of course involved also the ethics committee on a national level, which is just a must. If you're going to stop the your clinical investigation under the MDR, you will have to, if it's just temporary, a stop of the clinical investigation, there are specific guidance to when you will have to report that to the member state. And this is within 15 days, and if it's really urgent, then within 24 hours. And remember to have that specified in your protocol. If you're terminating your clinical investigation, it's 15 days, and it's if you will have to send in a summary of the reason behind, and also make sure that it will then within the Qmed database, this information will flow in between the different member states and the sponsor of similar studies. So that's why also we have this centralized submission. Is there could be other studies going on where the incidence, the reason why you terminate your study might have an influence on other studies. And there will be guidelines, these MDCD guidelines, they will come out. For instance, on submission of summary report or clinical investigation report, there will be some guidelines on what is actually needed in these report when you are submitting these to the European Commission. So these are just specifications when you will conduct studies in a multi-center study. So we went through these, there are specific timelines, how to do it, and what can the actually member states do. So let's not go through these details, but there are guidelines, or not guidelines, regulations. So during a clinical investigation, these are the reporting of the events, which is in Article 80. But during the investigation, you have to be sure that you have procedures for recording adverse events as they are identified in the clinical investigation plan. And that means that you can have in your protocol, so in your clinical investigation plan, events that you will record, and also events that you might not record because they are part of the state of the art of the disease, but you will have to have that described in your protocol. All serious adverse events will have to be recorded. All device deficiencies that might have led to a serious adverse event, and all new findings. So this is a new definition on how to report events. And this is also why we have new MDCD guidelines on this field. You will have to report to all relevant member states through the Qmed database, as well as if you have incomplete data. All SAEs that are linked to a medical device or comparator or to the investigational approach, and device deficiencies that might have led to an SAE and new findings. So again, today we have all different kinds of reporting requirements, which makes it very difficult actually to be compliant. But now this is unified through the European Commission. It's quite strict, also time-wise, but again, it's much clearer. PMCF investigations, remember these are all on post-market clinical follow-up studies. There you are not reporting the events to the authorities through this system, but you're using the normal vigilance system that is also described in the medical device regulation. So what are the timelines for reporting? This is very important because it has become a little more strict here. So in case something really seriously happen where there is a threat to the public health. So for instance, there was some incidents some years ago with bioscaffolds where they were at some conferences reporting of after 3 years, some of these patients got acute restroke or myocardial infarction. And there were thousands of patients that had this bioscaffolds or different kinds of bioscaffolds. So I assume that this was a public health threat and that this was reported to the authorities or would have within 2 days. If you have a death or serious deterioration of state of health, you have to report that within 10 days on which the manufacturer becomes aware. And any other serious incident is immediately any serious incident 15 days after the manufacturer becomes aware. So here we normally have 30 days, as far as I know, in most of the countries, and therefore you have to be very on your toes to get the information to be able to report within the required time period. Just to sum up about the Qmed database, it's going to be the central place for managing clinical investigation from the authorities' perspective. So this is where you submit your documentation. This is where you upload your documents, the key documents. You register, you have your applications, approvals, and any amendments. And also this is where you are reporting on your progress on the report, any termination, ongoing documentation and SAE reporting, and at the end you will also upload your clinical investigation report and the summary of the clinical investigation report, which needs to be in the language that can be understood by laymen and in the countries where you're going to market your product, and of course also publications. So this is going to be the central place for clinical investigations. So what type of clinical studies and investigations can be conducted? So I like to use this slide from one of my good friends from Global Strategic Solutions, that when you are an early startup company, you of course don't have these kind of different considerations of what to do, but a larger company, what type of study are we actually going to do? But even as a startup company, at what level are we in regards to the data which is actually needed to be able to provide sufficient input on the safety and performance? So there are 3 things that could make your life easier. So first of all, consider what customers that you are going to approach. Is this a new concept that for the customers that you would like to approach, that this is something new? Then more data, a more complicated data would be needed. The same with the technology. Are you producing or developing something which is similar to existing, or you're really into something very new that no one else has seen before? And the same also with the anatomy. Are you developing something which is used as by existing customers, within the existing technology and existing anatomy? Then the need for data might be lower than if you were in the other end. So it's just that there is not one answer to this. This is a rationale that you will have to build up. There are also some other activities that you would have to do before you are able to actually come to a conclusion on what to do. And a lot of this are also, how can you say that, linked to the way that you structure your company and how your financing is. How is your board actually working? What is it that they're looking for? Are you a company that's going to stay forever, or are you a company that's going to you have to do the first early stage trials and then you are going to be sold off to somebody else or bought by somebody else? But what helps you in taking these decisions is to conduct a thorough risk analysis, both on the product but also on the clinical study and then on the business. So if you have conducted these and you have a good overview of what is the risk to these key processes, that will help you. Then evaluate the risk and the related harms and use the literature or other information how to quantify these risks and harms. And of course, the most important is your product here. And then you will be able to, based on that, to say, what are we looking for in regards to safety, performance, and clinical benefits, and defining your claims related to that. This is the process that I use when I meet a new client and now they ask me how to do this. What are we going to look for? We run through these risk assessments, maybe not as detailed as you would like to do for in the development process, but put something down in writing so you can see the different risks to both these three different processes. Just as a help for also the benefit analysis. One thing that has, I think, been neglected for quite some time is that you are not really, it's not always that I see the companies are able to make a good benefit assessment and do, how can you say that, you would like to define some measurable benefits, because then you are also much better in evaluating which of these benefit or claims should I actually go for. So you don't take all 20, but maybe 3 of them are really important for you, also compared to some of your competitors. So I like to use this kind of template for brainstorming when we do benefit risk assessments. We go through the type of benefit, magnitude of benefit, and so on, and we do it measurable. We find the test reports, the data from the literature, other clinical data, usability data, and make sure that we are all aligned in the team about what is the measurable benefit for our product, our device, or our device system. When you have done that, the benefit risk assessment is much easier to do, and this can be, as I said, both on the clinical study itself, on the company itself, but of course on the product. So these are, in this slide, it's the clinical risk and benefits that we are talking about. So when we look at the benefits, you are having a measurable impact on health, including the size of benefit to patient, probability, and the duration, measured up against the clinical risk in regards to severity, probability, and the duration. And then you will be able to see if you are still in balance. Do you still provide sufficient benefit compared to the risk when you are looking at this analysis, comparing or in relation to the patients, the users, and third parties. So jumping a little to some other definitions, I just want to make sure that there are some key things that we need to have in place also when you're writing your protocol. So clinical performance is one of them. It means actually the ability of a device resulting from any direct or indirect medical effect that stems from the technical and functional characteristics, and again within the intended use and so on, leading to a clinical benefit for patients. So clinical performance, again, is the main part, together with the safety that we mentioned at the end here on the same slide, that we would like to look after. So we just stressed the risk, now performance. And the benefit is the positive impact of a device. So what are you claiming that your product can do in terms of meaningful, measurable, patient-relevant clinical outcome related to diagnosis and so on. So just to see, it's not something that is really coming out of the blue. It is now stated directly into the law text and also the guidelines. And at the end of the day, you would like to have clinical safety being a quantitative residual risk, so the harm to the subject, which is derived from the risk analysis that we were just talking about. So when you look at these 3 different parameters, this is where you would like to have a benefit that outweigh the residual risk of the use of the product. I promised you also to have an overview of the different different type of studies. And the reason why we have that here after the just talking about the benefit risk assessment is that you will, along the way, moving from pre-market to post-market, your benefit risk ratio might change. So the benefit risk ratio is something that you would have to keep in mind during the whole procedure or whole development of your product. This table is taken directly from the ISO 14155, and it's explained. Now, I did not copy in the text, the blue numbers. There are specific text explaining what each of these different study types, what it means. So again, for instance, if you are pre-market, where that means that it's a non-CE mark product, you can both be very early stage in the pilot state or in the pivotal stage. You will have in the pilot state exploratory or confirmatory, that's difficult to say here late afternoon, confirmatory clinical studies. And sometimes these very early stage exploratory or confirmatory studies do not have a statistical rationale to build upon. There you basically pick a number. But when you do that, you also know that this is just a pre-study kind of. You will have to have a pilot or a pivotal clinical investigation that are supported by statistical rationale, where you know the number of patients that you would need to prove a hypothesis. If you go to the post-market stage, you can actually run a study from the pilot to the post-market that are both confirmatory. So you continue your pivotal study into a post-market clinical investigation. And all of these studies that I just mentioned is interventional studies. But you can also have a post-market stage study that is a non-interventional study, meaning that you are not performing extra procedures to the subjects, and you are working within the intended use, as we just spoke about before with the submission to the authorities. These are called registers or post-market clinical investigations. They will become more and more present because these are now, they were also that before under the MDD, but they are really emphasized in the medical device regulation that these studies are needed to confirm your safety and performance when your product is used on the market in a post-market setting in a broader population. So what the European Commission is worried about is that when you release, you have maybe done a 50-patient study and you're releasing this for the market, and releasing it for a more diverse population might actually give you different feedback or different results than it was for the 50-patient study, and they would like you to keep an eye on that. So just comparing the different type of studies, the pilot study, you don't really need confirmation of valid or it's a weak or no hypothesis claim, so no statistics. You need confirmation of valid endpoints, so you're testing out actually what your endpoint in a later pivotal clinical study could be, and then a confirmation of time point of endpoint assessment. So when am I going to measure these endpoints? The pivotal study is the classical study with a strong hypothesis. You have a statistical rationale, it's more patients, you have the follow-up that is needed, and it's statistical powered. And post-market, you can actually have longer term follow-up on these post-market study, because you would like to, or normally you can agree with your notified body, even if you have maybe an implant, that you follow your subjects in a pivotal study for 2-3 years, and then you run the study as on the post-market setting and continue the surveillance of these subjects to be sure that real-world data is collected. So now just into some additional thoughts about setting studies up. So I have tried, because it normally is said that clinical studies are very expensive and it's very cumbersome and detailed and whatever, and let's do some surveys or do some registered a collection of registered data. I just need to check the time because I'm talking a lot. So I've tried to mimic here the different steps and the levels of the quality of data that can be collected from the different type of studies. So you have clinical investigations, registers for both large companies and small companies, national register, investigator-initiated studies, and also hospital databases and surveys. So not good. Of course, the clinical investigations are the most expensive, but this is also where you get the most controlled data if that's needed. And the surveys, they're cheaper. The data that you get are of a different quality. They're very good, for instance, for giving input to claims, or claims like your product is easy to use, even though that you have proved that through usability study, using a survey when your product is on the market to demonstrate or to confirm that your product is easy to use on the real life setting. Their surveys are really excellent tools. So just to go through them quickly, surveys are normally where you use the Likert scale to ask questions to users. You don't involve patients normally, so you don't need, for most of these ethics committee approval, they are on CE marked products. And it's all different kinds of questions that you can ask. But please make sure when you are using surveys as data collection tools, link these to your actual claims. Make sure you make a very detailed analysis, so you don't end up with a lot of data that you don't need, or you have set up the surveys so they don't really give any meaning at all. Hospital databases, they give very good data. It's big data. It's very varied in the patient population, and it really captures real world clinical data, both on and off label. There is sometimes a lot of off-label use, and you of course will have to be able to demonstrate that you have taken action upon this. So, but if you have some kind of way to get access to these big databases, definitely do so. They are very supportive, and not supportive, but very valuable. Then there are investigator-initiated studies. They're also very popular here. They are cheaper than a normal investigation. You can manage to get some input on the protocol, so you are actually seeing collection of safety and performance endpoints. The downside is that normally these studies don't have the focus that you really would like to have. If they are really concentrated around safety and performance, these are more regulatory driven, and the investigators are normally more, how do you say that, research driven. So they might not have the best interest in running your study, and therefore it takes a long time. And basically what some I've seen some numbers that they're not actually as cheap as many people would like to say that they are, and they cost quite a lot of money. The hospitals require a lot of money to run these studies, and the data are not always that good. You have to keep an eye on that, and also you have to have hands off basically on these investigator-initiated study, and then fund these studies through the hospitals. But you don't have any saying in how the study is actually, how it's run. Then there are national registers. Again, very good data comes out of these. We have something called Sweetheart in Sweden, of course, that where within the coronary field, that I know that a lot of companies are collecting data from these databases. There are not really, you can collect the data, but you can't really query them. You cannot really do anything about them. So you are out of control basically of the data set. So again, can use the data, but it has limited application. And then we have small product registers, and I think large product register, and only difference is the price. You are running these. The number of data points that you are collecting is limited, but on the other side, it's something that you are controlling, and that there is more control over the database, and you will be asked by the notified bodies and others that might be inspecting you, or when you want to use the data, that they actually want to see the compliance and these things, and you might have used it for something where it wasn't really applicable. So keep an eye out on this. Sorry, I will skip that. The pre-CE mark study, the investigational, the clinical investigation, very expensive. You have full control. Safety and performance is defined. Claims can be verified. This is, of course, the ultimate way to do it, but it is expensive. It takes a long time to prepare a proper study, and there are many, many hurdles. It's a lot of stakeholders that are normally working together, and communication in itself is just can be very, very difficult. So make sure that you are conducting, if you are running a clinical investigation, do it very precise and only for the data where you really need it, and optimize, but not too much, because then you will drown in trying to be compliant, basically, which can be, for smaller companies, quite difficult. Oops, this is a duplicate. How did that come in there? Now we have a break just for questions, and I can just clear my throat a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you, Helene. It's super interesting, and especially I've worked with claims before, and you make it easier to understand, even for me.
It's not that easy, actually.
No. We have a question from Anna, who asks, what would be the considerations for reporting of adverse events if the device is a mobile application, so class 1?
If it's a non-CE marked being tested on a clinical investigation, you follow the same rules. There are no difference in between the different classifications. If it's a CE marked product, you follow the vigilance and the reporting requirements for the ethics committee, the National Ethics Committee.
All right. Does that answer your question, Anna? Otherwise, let us know.
Yeah, just shout out in case.
Perfect.
Thanks. Good.
Do you need maybe a short break, or
Let's take a short break? I'll just find some water, and then I'll be back in 2 or 3 minutes. Is that okay?
That's perfect. Let's say we meet back at 35.
Yes.
While we wait for Helene to come back, I'm just gonna do a bit of advertising for our next event coming up on April 29th in the morning, Central European Time. I'll post a link in the chat. And welcome back, Helene.
Thank you very much. So let's do the last 10 slides, and they're actually a little bit about claims still, because it's quite important topic. Let me just see here. I need to move that. And do you see my slides?
Yep, it works.
That sounds good. So now we have kind of it's a very broad topic. So I know I'm covering a lot and maybe too superficial about the actually operational part, but more on what actually consider when you are just before running a clinical study. What would you need to consider from a business perspective? But I think that's equally important to how you operational runs it. So, but otherwise, please feel free. But I think we have laid the background for what the regulation is, what is required, where you can find the information, and what actually is the basic input to what study you will have to conduct. And I think we will wrap up here now with the last couple of slides, just preparing for a couple of questions, and then hopefully it will help you along the way. So I've tried to make kind of a small table and of course this can be different from large companies and smaller companies, but it can even be different indications for a company that just have one product. to use the same kind of setup to find out what is actually required for our product or products with the indication for use. How can we optimize on what we have to be able to present to the investors or the community or whoever that we have a product where there are available data in different places, what is really needed, and what kind of setup of the clinical investigations can we actually use. So what we just went through were different type of clinical investigations or methods to use: investigator-initiated studies or PMCF studies, or a true pre-CE mark clinical investigation. What is actually needed for your classification of device? So class 2A1, we have 2B, and we have class 3. So I know it sounds like this is for a large company, but it can actually also be a method that can be used for a smaller company with just one product, with one classification, but maybe several intended use. How can we actually use these methods to optimize? Because of course, for investigator-initiated studies, they might be used for just supporting some of the claims that we would like to address for our product. And we will use surveys for more use-related claims. And then we will take the hardcore safety and performance objective, turn them into endpoint, and do a pre-CE mark study. So this is the thought process behind that. I would like to emphasize that normally when companies are talking about doing clinical investigation, they only see it as this pre-CE mark study, but there are other methods that you can use and then will optimize in several different ways. So, and I just like this table. I like things that are boxes basically, so it makes it much clearer to see actually and the decisions behind. So when you look into it, these are just basically what I said, that they are not just one solution for the same kind of products. So for class 1 products, doing pre-CE mark investigation, which is very expensive, might not be the best option. For class 3 product, yes, you will have to do it. The same for class 3 product, just doing surveys will not work. It is simply not regulatory enough, and you will have to in any way do a pre-CE market study. So normally you will have to have a mix of different methods, and you will have to come up with that rationale yourself by doing the pre-analysis of your claims and your literature, your benefits, the measurable documentation of the measures. What happened here? Just give me a second. I use my arms and then here we go. We're back. I will leave this wood so I don't do that again. So it's more to make sure that you understand that, explore the different opportunities that you have. In case that you also fail with some of the different methods, you have other activities ongoing that might be able to help you through to the CE marking. So what can be done with the different data? We know about this. I think we all know about the quality and relevance of clinical data, and what's highest level is the meta-analysis, systematic reviews, and so on, randomized controlled trials, and then it walks down to expert opinions. Again, they have different way in your analysis and a contribution to your rationale behind what is sufficient amount and quality of data. And the nice thing about how the regulation is set up is that it is you as a manufacturer that will have to argue what is enough. In sufficient quality, yes, you will have to have some kind of quality assurance around your product. You have to use ISO 14155 where it's relevant, but sufficient amount, this you will have to prove and document, compare that to the state-of-the-art scenario of the area where you are in, the treatment options, the alternative treatment options for these patient populations. So keep that in mind. Wrapping up by stating that claims is something which is now have been emphasized in the medical device regulation. You can no longer have claims stated on your homepage, in your IFU and other material where you don't have any data to support that. So, and clinical claims, you will have to have clinical evidence to support that. And a lot of manufacturers are rephrasing their claims these days to be able to comply with the medical device regulation. And they have a tendency to sneak in your text, in your homepage, or because it seems easy just to state that something is easy or the best product in the world or whatever it is. But you will have to understand that you will need data for that. And it is because for a patient, for a user, to be able to see what your product can actually do is quite important. I use a tool where I go through the different claims for the product. And again, I make this measurable. I do this claims table that I have copied in the header of that. And I simply go through both intended use, indication for use for your product, what document that I have reviewed, and the specific claims. I then list them and I add if I need, if they're included in my verification or the validation activities on the clinical evidence needed, or sorry, the objective evidence. And then I state if clinical evidence is needed for some of these claims. So of course you verify them first or validate them, but do you need validation under clinical settings? Other supporting evidence, the level, and then any comments. Again, put it into boxes so you have control and that you all agree. I think that's very important that you within your team agree upon what can be stated around our product. So search for the data that you really need and ask around with the people that are going to use your product, the users, the physicians, the nurses. What are you going to actually state around your product? And then set up, no, this one I will skip. I think it's when you're working with devices, what the medical device regulation is actually, what they want is that you repeatedly are able to provide evidence through your activities to support safety and performance criteria or objectives. They are reported, documented in your clinical evaluation process, but you will have to have some activities where you can show that you have actively tried to collect these data. And how does it look like with the benefit risk ratio for your product on an ongoing basis? So this is the tricky part. This is what is making it very complicated for companies these days, is that clinical investigation, which is what's about today, has to be repeated. And before you did a clinical investigation for high-risk class products, and then you didn't really do much more. You were collecting vigilance and other activities or data. But now you would actually have to show that you are actively collecting data. And this is also for lower risk class products, that you have some active methods to do that and to be implemented in your clinical evaluation report. So I hope this gave a little clarity, some input to how to think about clinical investigations, not so much from practical point, but more what the regulation is saying and how from a business perspective you should think about it. And then I hope that there are some questions.
Yes, let us know if there are any questions. Until someone else asks something, Helene.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how many do you think it's going to affect after May 26th?
Well, what I heard here the other day, but this was someone who was specialized within quality management systems. They stated that it was only about 18-20% of the medical device manufacturers that were ready for medical device. Yeah, that's a little scary. So I was just closing my eyes and thinking, that's not true. But it is, I think that it takes, for instance, what we're talking about today, clinical investigations, takes time. We had 3 years plus 1 due to the COVID-19, this period to prepare. And just to I've just spent 9 months to set up a contract with a client and to conduct a clinical study. And now that takes 5 years, right? So it is a huge machinery. It's a very stretchy processes that you have to initiate. And of course, a lot of companies don't have the resources or the competences really to set this up. And I think a lot of companies will run into trouble. I hope that they have their CE mark under the MDD for some time, so they had a little more slack.
Yeah, yeah. How much slack do they get? What would you say?
Until 2024, if they have a renewed certificate under MDD, they have until 2024, and then they can sell their product until 2025.
Okay.
For IBD, the deadline is next year, 2022, and then they have similar period.
All right. So I guess you'll be busy in the in the next.
We're very busy.
Yeah.
We are very busy. So it's basically clinical evaluations, and it's trying to avoid doing clinical studies. Companies don't have resources or capacities, financial capacity to run a study, and they don't really see always the opportunity of having these different methods. Use that as much as possible, and then to be able to show to the authorities and notified bodies that they tried different ways to collect as much data as possible.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think maybe people have been asking the questions that they wanted to ask along the way.
It's a late afternoon, so I understand fully.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But thank you
sorry,
so much. Oh,
okay,
sorry.
Can I ask just one question?
Oh,
Yeah, so first of all, this really excellent presentation. So
Thank you.
so much insight. So really fantastic. I was wondering. So my question is that what sort of services can your company offer for companies interested to do clinical investigations? Can you support like designing a trial or helping to process the data collected scientifically, or what sort of things can you do?
Yeah. Basically, you can call and you can say, Helene, I'm in trouble. I need some data. Will you take it from here and then go and do it and call me in how long time it takes. We can do that. We are 20 people. We are 35 subcontractors, and we run studies worldwide. What we do a lot, which I really like, is that we are not enough hands to do this. So coaching, training, teaching people to do it themselves is what we try to convince most people to do. Also financially, costs a lot of money, but also we need more people that can do this. So we do, we are the backup. So you call me, you say, Helene, I think this is how we measure our product. Fine. Here's the template for the protocol. You write 1/3. I look at it and you say, yeah, you're on your way. You write the rest, and then we go step by step. And basically, it's everything in between there. So we address it to maybe you're a one-man band and you have no chance in running a full-blown clinical study. You will need full support, right? Or you have maybe 10 people and we need to support you and train you so you can keep on doing this forever.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
yeah, thank you, and a great question. And it also leads up to one of the things that I'm going to send afterwards. I'm going to send you a link to a course that Helene will be conducting with one of our Healthtech Nordic partners, Norway Healthtech. So I'll include that in the follow-up email. But if there are no more questions, thank you so much for your time once again, Helene, and thank you to everyone who participated. I will send you the video once it's ready, and the different links that I just mentioned, and also thank you to Josephine, who's been helping setting this event up. Yeah, so thank you for spending the afternoon with us. And we hope to see you another time, and you too, Helene.
Yeah, of course, anytime. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.